All right. Think I'm live. So, this is going to be the structure. I'm going to start off by, again, talking about what I'm doing, where I'm at, and then I'm going to discuss what I'm going to do in this stream and go from there. And then at the end of the stream, as usual, there will be a Q&A. So I'll be answering all of your questions that are in the chat. I'll be answering all of those questions at the end. So if you ask questions, stick around to the end so that you can see the answer to your question. Otherwise, these will always be available on the YouTube channel and on Twitch after the stream is complete. So what is it we're doing? Okay, we're continuing a stream series where I've been basically showing the process of test-driven development. The idea of test-driven development is that you can write your tests before you develop the features. There's a lot of benefits to that. If you want to know more about that, watch the other streams. Where are we at now? Well, we're building a contact list. We've already built several of the components. We're working on the higher order component now, and we're finishing up the final tests. We got a little bit stuck in the last stream, so what we're going to do is start by fixing that problem that I had in the last stream. Then we're going to refactor the test a little bit to make it cleaner. And then we're going to finish the rest of the tests, hopefully in this stream, I think so. And then after that, we're going to style it up and break everything into basically componentize the app a little bit more. And since we'll have all of these tests written, we'll be able to test for regressions as we break these things into components. So with that being said, without further ado, time to get started. So yesterday's test problem was that we were here in the app.test.js file, and I realized something interesting, which was that in order to match, so if I go down to where we were here, we're checking to see if we're calling local storage.setItem with a very particular set of objects, but this set of objects has IDs, ID of 0 and ID of 1. Within our test, within the realm of our tests, we have the concept of IDs so far for our contact objects. But in the actual application, we've yet to implement that. So here's what I'm thinking. The reason why I wanted the concept of IDs was for two reasons. The first reason was within the contact list. And if we look here, you can see we're using the IDs to give each one a unique test ID. And also, actually, that looks like it's it. Within the contact list, we're really only using IDs for test IDs. The second place where we're using IDs is actually within the, I think it's the app component in the delete contact. So when we click delete, we're using the IDs to figure out which contact to remove from the array of contacts. So after realizing that, I realized we don't even really need unique IDs for this to work. So I'm going to remove the concept of IDs. So no more IDs, which means I'm going to have to update the old tests. So just here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the contact list. And instead of using IDs, because we're removing the concept of IDs completely, we're going to use the index. So the index right here, as we're mapping through and listing out each contact in our contact list, instead of using a unique identifier, let's just use the index. Now, again, I'm getting some questions in the chat. I will definitely be answering all of your questions in the chat at the end of the stream, so stick around. So instead of using c.id, I'm going to use index. So basically, I'll just do a search replace in here, and every time there's a c.id, we'll replace it with index. Now, for the contact list tests, we have to go back in here and remove this concept of IDs because we're no longer using IDs. But since we know the order of the array that we're passing in as the contact prop here, we know the order is right here because we're defining it right here. And we know that Joe is at index 0 and Bob is at index 1, it correlated perfectly with the IDs that were already here of 0 and 1, right? So I don't have to change anything in here for the tests. It should work. Now, for the delete, what we're going to have to do is, where are we at? Instead of using the contact and then grabbing the ID and trying to find the ID that way, we're going to use the index. The reason why this is safe, the reason why this is going to work is because the contacts, there's only one source of truth for the array of contacts. You see, we're setting the contacts array in state here in this app component, right? And then we're passing that into, if we find it really quick, the contact list, which we're not rendering here. But if we go to the contact list, you can see that we're passing in a prop called contacts. That's going to be the exact same array as this, which means that the indices will correlate with each other because they're the same array. That's important to note because now I can, instead of passing in the contact here, I can pass in the contact index. And we can compare and say, if we look at the filter function, instead of pulling out the just each item, you can also grab the index. So we're going to say, I'll explain why I'm doing underscore in a second. So I'm saying underscore because I just don't care about this variable. So you can name the variable whatever you want as long as it's valid JavaScript variable name. But since I'm not going to use this anymore like I was right here, I just want to use an underscore so that it's just very obvious that I don't care about it. Because what I care about is this index here, the second argument of this function. And I want to check and see if that index, or I, is equal to the same index that we're passing in here, which we're calling contact index. So that is the new way. So it looks like I pretty much removed the concept of IDs from all of this. Let me go ahead and get rid of that and this. And I think we're good. So save that and let's see what happens with the tests. Okay, so all of the tests are now passing. And we fixed it because we got rid of the idea of IDs. Now, more questions are popping up in the chat. Just going to remind you that I will be answering all of your questions at the end of this stream. So keep putting them in the chat. Just want to let you know that I'm not ignoring you. I will be answering them at the end of the stream. All right, so step one was just basically getting the test to work, removing the concept of IDs. The second thing I want to do really quick is I want to refactor a little bit of this test to make it clean because I'm doing a lot of code duplication, right? So look at this. You see, as I highlight this line here, query by test ID on the modal form, I'm using that a lot. So why not just create a reference to it? So const modal equals, cut that, set that equal to it, and then replace all of these with that variable. Looks like I forgot a parenthesis right here. And I think there's one more right here. So let's see if the tests still pass. All right, looks good. I think that might be it for this test, other than, of course, going back and doing the same thing with the modals here. So let's set this. Just try to reduce the amount of duplication going on in here. Then same thing here. And I think just about done here. Refactoring. Yeah. Okay. Cool. I think that's going to do it for the refactor, or like cleaning up this test. Now I can quickly write this test. Okay, so now what we want to do is make sure we have the ability to delete contacts, right? So properly manages the deletion of contacts. So how can we test this out? Well, the best way to do it is to probably, here, let's say we have 2 contacts. We're going to create 2 contacts. So very similar to how we say properly stores submitted users, we can kind of copy this test right here and paste it into here. And we want to, I'm going to read through this and see what it's doing. So we're going to create a reference to the modal. The modal should not be in the document. We're going to add a contact called Joe, which there's a lot of stuff in this test that we don't really care about since it's already being tested in other tests that I can just remove, that these certain assertions that we just don't really care about. So we don't really care about, maybe we care about this. I'll comment it out for now. So what we're doing here is we're adding a contact with Joe. We're adding Bob back to back here. I don't really care about this assertion in this test. So what we care about is this. Perfect. So it looks like I might not even need a reference to the modal, so I'll comment that out as well. So all this is doing is rendering the app, adding Joe, adding Bob, and then we're expecting that local storage has been called with both Joe and Bob. So now we're expecting that both of these, both Joe and Bob are both in local storage currently. Now what we want to do is click on the delete button. And the test is essentially going to say, after I click on the delete button for, let's just say Bob or Joe, let's do Joe, we would expect the same thing to happen, but only with Bob. Because Joe should be removed, so therefore we should be setting it as just Bob. So between here and here is where we want to do the delete button clicking. Now, I think the standard so far of what I've been doing is to click on, to have a test ID for the delete button, or the test ID. I think I'm using test IDs. Let's look. This is going to be in the contact list component. And we have a data test ID called delete button and then the index for that contact. So let's do const delete btn is equal to screen.get by test ID. Delete btn. Is it btn? I think it's btn, right? btn. Delete btn, and then the index for Joe is 0, right? So 0. So we're going to click on the delete button for Joe. So we'll fire an event.click for the delete button. And once we do that, that's when we would expect to call local storage.setItem with just Bob. Since we're deleting Joe, we should expect it to just be called with Bob after we click on the delete button. So let's see if this test does what we hope it does. Definitely does not. So it says, unable to find an element with data test ID delete button 0. So let's look at what's going on. If we look at the contact list, we can see that the data test ID is delete btn and then the index. We are, where are we at? So the app test. We are rendering the app. We have added a contact called Joe. We have added a contact called Bob. I already know what's going on. So basically, we need to render the contact list underneath the contact modal and the add contact button. So here we can say contact list, and we need to feed it the contacts prop, which is just going to be equal to contacts, which is this state up here. But contact list also takes on delete click and on edit click. So on edit click and on delete click. Now we have, for on delete click, we have our delete contact function, which will very simply just pass in right here. And do we have an edit? We do not yet have an edit function, but really all it's going to do is set adding contact to true, and it's also going to set like an edits flag or something like that. So for now, since we have yet to write the test for that feature, I'm just going to have it console.log something. console.log edit. And it says, there we go. Wait. I don't know why it's yellow. I'm trying to figure out why it's yellow. Whoops. No duplicate props allowed. Oh, well, silly me. Okay. So, contact list is not defined because I need to import it. Let's import it. All right. So I save. Let's see what happens. If I scroll all the way down, how about I run npm test and see what happens? Okay, we get a ton of horrifying errors. Cannot read property map of undefined. So the contact list, we probably need to make sure that contacts is defined before we render this out. So I'm going to initialize this as an empty array and see if that helps. Okay. I initialized it as an empty array, and my console's really messy right now. And I can't tell where things end and start. That's not good. So I'm going to see if I can just quickly open this up in a separate console just so I can see what this looks like, because that was a little bit too messy. I think it's under here. No, it's... Okay, let's try this again. But at least here I'll have a full screen window, and I'll know where it starts and ends. Okay, so what's happening is now, just by changing that one small thing, I'm seeing that 3 tests have failed, all within the same test suite. The first one that says failed was show contact modal when add contact button is clicked. And the specific thing, it says value must be an HTML element or SVG element. Received has value null. Okay. So by initializing this as an empty array, we have done terrible things. We introduced regressions. Okay, so that's great. That means that our test-driven development is working. So instead of doing it like that, let's wrap this in here and say if contacts, if that is not undefined, then go ahead and render our contact list. And I think I'm running, okay, let's see. Let's see. Looks like it's still broken. So then maybe that wasn't actually what was causing the error. But it makes me wonder now, because I do not believe this was erroring out like this just a moment ago. What is the difference between now and then? So let's try to narrow this down and figure out where this might be coming from. So we'll get rid of the things that I've added. Run npm test. Try and see what is causing all of these things to error out. Interesting. Now, I'm pretty sure this wasn't happening like very recently, right? And I'm going to comment this test out so that it's not filling up the console with extra noise. So 2 are failing now. Expected received to be in the document received. Okay, so the modal. Okay. The problem seems to lie I wonder why it didn't catch this the first time. Let's see if this fixes it. So shows contact modal when the contact button is clicked. Okay. Let's find that one. Shows contact modal when the add contact button is clicked. Let's replace each of these modal references with the full-on query by test ID and see if only one of them fails now instead of two. Yeah, okay, so that's the problem. I'll explain this in a second. So hides contact modal. Hides contact modal. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, so now they should be passing again. All right, so basically what was happening is I only had one reference to the modal, but then as the test went on, certain things changed and I still had the same reference to the modal. The reality is every single time I'm doing these expects, I should be having a new reference to the modal variable. So it was a mistake to have a single reference. I needed separate references like this. So that was what was causing that crazy error. But I thought it would have caught it the first time, but it did not. So that's unfortunate because that was a little bit of a waste of time. Okay, so now it should go back to failing the delete test. Perfect. Okay, so now let's try to go back to where we were we're rendering contacts. And I really did prefer the way where we just basically initialized contacts with an empty array. So let's try it like that, see what happens. Okay. So this is what it was called with. So we're calling it with the empty array. That's because we do that on the initial get-go. Then we are adding Joe. And then here we have Joe and Bob. Now the problem is that in the delete function, it looks like we need to actually pass in the contact index, right? So let's try to see, we're accepting the contact index within our higher order app component, but we didn't update the actual delete contact functionality, like what we're passing to that in our actual contact list, right? So in our contact list where we call the delete button, right here, we're saying on delete click, and we're passing in C. We need to instead pass in the index. Let's see what happens. Okay, we get a little bit further, I think. So now it says expect delete function to have been called with contacts 0. Okay, so interestingly enough, calls the delete function when the delete button is clicked. This is not the same test. This is the contact list test. So because I changed how we were doing that, I think we need to update this test really quick. Instead of calling it with contacts, with the actual contact, we were expecting the delete function to get called with literally the number 0. So let's see if that fixes that particular test. So instead of 2 failing, only 1 should fail now. Oh, actually, they both pass now. So that fixed both. That's awesome. All right, got some Twitch spam in the chat. All right. So those tests are passing now. Every single test is passing. So I think delete is working now. That's awesome. All right, so I think the only thing left is going to be edit, functionality-wise. So let's take a moment to go to the contact list and make sure that there is an edit. Okay, so we're calling edit on. We're passing in the contact for edit, but I'm wondering if we should just follow the same pattern that we're doing here with delete and just passing in the index instead. So I'm going to try that. Now that might make tests fail. I don't know yet. Let's find out. It did. So within here, we're going to have to, so I fixed the calls the delete, but we need to do calls the edit. So instead of calling it with the actual contact, we're going to call it with the index. So now they should pass. Very good. Okay, so now we have that set up. In our higher order component, let's go ahead and write the test. So pretty similarly to the delete test, we're going to say that this is testing that it properly manages the edit scenario for the contact modal. All right. What do we expect to happen when we are editing? Well, let's look at the contact list test, because I think we have a test that already kind of handles the edit scenario. I think it's at the top, right? We have edit contact, and it should initialize the form with the contact information already populated, right? So if we pass in a contact to the contact modal, it should pre-populate it. And that's already being tested. That's being tested within the context of the actual contact modal. So we don't need to test anything like that in our app test. The only thing that we care about in our app test is that we are indeed showing the modal when the edit button is clicked, and that the proper props are being passed to the contact modal. Okay, so we'll start by rendering the app. We need to have at least one contact so that we can edit a contact. So I'm going to set add contacts Joe. So we'll add Joe. At this point, we're going to grab a reference to the edit button. So I will actually copy this and change this to edit BTN, and then change delete to edit. So now we have a reference to the edit button. Then we're going to fire a click event for the edit button. Okay, at this point, now we would expect to see the modal. That's one thing, right? So we would expect to see the contact modal. So the best way to do that is, honestly, I'll just copy this and say that we would expect this .to be in the document. But instead of query by test ID, I'm just going to do get. Okay, so at this point, I would expect it to be in the document. Let's see if at least this much passes. I know it won't because we have yet to add that functionality. So the second thing that we care about in the scenario of the edit button click is that we pass in the contact to the component. So how can we test that a component has been given the props that we would expect? And the answer is I have no idea, but I can look it up really quick. Or there's another way to do it, which is just to basically check and see if that particular user's information has been properly, kind of like what we're doing here with initialize this form with contact information. We can check and see if the user's information is in the form. But what's good, you see, is that since we know that this component is working properly, we have a test for this component that works properly, we can pretty much just go in and check only one of the fields instead of all of them, because if one of the fields works, we know all of them are, just because we're already testing this very thoroughly in here. But I do want to check and see on the Google really quick if there is an official way to check for props. That is not what I was trying to click. Thanks, Google. Check if component received props. How to test if a component is rendered with the right props when using React Testing Library. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Okay, so what they are doing is there's an actual function called to have been called with props. Okay, so they're mocking the component, and then in the test they're saying they're expecting that component to have been called with a specific set of props. Now, what is context? That's interesting. Then there's another way to do it, looks like. But I'm wondering, let's try it this way first, but I don't know what this context variable is. Like, obviously I get what props are, but what is this? So maybe we'll get some better knowledge in my VS Code in IntelliSense that will help me decode that a little bit. So let's give this a shot. So I'm going to copy this over. I need to import the contact list component in order for this to work. Whoa. contact list. We're going to need a reference to the contact list. And that's going to come from there. Wait, I'm in the contact modal right now. That's not where I want to be. I want to be in here. Okay. Then in our test, wherever it might be, here we go, properly manages the edit scenario for the contact modal. By the way, I'm going to pull this out of this describe block in a second because the only reason I had this describe block was so that I can have this before each for a certain subset of tests. We don't need that before each for this test because we're not going to, well, actually we do. I take that back. We kind of do. I'll explain it in a moment. So let's see how this works. This is going to be, instead of fetch next page button, is going to be contact list. And then we're going to replace this reference with contact list. Now, I want to take a moment to look and see what this tells me. To have been called was the first. Okay, so unfortunately, it's an any, meaning that I don't know. I'm going to assume that props is going to be a object where each key is the prop name, and then the value for those keys are the value for that prop. But I have no idea what they're expecting for context. It says, optionally, you can provide a type for the expected arguments via a generic. Is that what the context would be? I'm going to try to do it without the context and see if we can get this thing to work. So we would expect contact list to be rendered or called with, we could say, contacts. And the value of contacts is always going to be an array. I'm sorry, actually, I think for this, it should be contact. And the value should be Joe. So Joe, right? Because we're clicking on the edit button for Joe. And when we render the contact list component in the scenario for edit, we're expecting to pass in a new prop called contact. And yeah, okay. Now I'm wondering something else, right? So we have to pass in an onEdit function. Okay. So this might not work. We may have to do it the other way. But if we have to do it the other way, that's fine. I'm not that concerned about it. But it's all about learning and teaching. All right, let's where are we at? So we need a piece of state for edit. Yeah, so edit contact, set edit contact equals use state, initialize it as undefined. Then in the case of const edit contact, when we click on an edit button for a contact, if you remember, we're accepting the contact index as the argument. Then what we want to do is set edit contact equal to contacts contact index. So the state for edit contact will be the contact that we're editing. Okay. But this is actually interesting because the onSubmit or the onEdit, I guess we would call it, I don't know. I need to look at the contact modal. Do we only have one callback? We have submit. Perfect. So the submit is going to be slightly different in the edit case than it is here. So we're going to need a separate one of these. So adding contact, instead of checking for adding contact, we're going to check for edit contact. And if edit contact is not undefined, we're going to render this. Cancel can stay the same. Actually, instead of adding contact to false, we're going to do set edit contact to undefined. And then in the submit, instead of saying set adding contact to false, we're going to again do set edit contact to undefined. Then for the actual submit, we are going to do something a little bit different. So we will have to basically, instead of adding a new contact like we are here, we're going to have to replace a given contact. So it's going to be a little bit more complex logic than what's going on here. So I comment this out, and I'm basically going to rewrite this logic for the edit case. So we need to grab a reference to the contact that we're editing, which we already know because we have that reference already here. I mean, that is edit contact, right? That is the contact we are editing. So I'm wondering, at this point, instead of edit contact being the actual contact, it should be an index. Yeah. And it looks like I might not need this. Okay. I know this is like a lot. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to say contact index. When the edit button is clicked for a contact, we're going to set edit contact to that index. So edit contact is actually going to be the index. Now, if edit contact is not undefined, because since it could be 0, that could be falsy, and then if it's falsy, if this is 0, this could not have the behavior we are expecting. So let's check specifically for if it's not undefined, or we could say type of edit contact is equal to number, so we could be even more specific. If type of edit contact is equal to number, then we want to render this out. Now, the contact, so remember we have to pass in a contact prop now, is going to be equal to contact, and then we have the index here, which is going to be edit contact. So now we're passing in the contact here. The cancel, that stays the same. So now we're going to basically edit the contact that we're passing in on the submit. So the C is the contact. So I know I keep saying contact. How many times can I say contact in this video? We're going to set this to be set contacts. And we're going to say C.map. Sorry, contacts.map. And for each contact, if, let's grab a reference to the index as well. So contact and index. If index is equal to edit contact, then let's return C. Otherwise, let's return contact. All right. So we're basically mapping the contacts. If we land on the one that is the one we're editing, let's replace it with the new one from the form. Otherwise, just return the regular old thing. And then when we're done, set edit to undefined, so it should close the modal. That was kind of a rough patch, but I think I got through it. Don't know if that is that's going to work, but let's test it and find out. Unfortunately, I don't even know if this method of testing is going to work, so let's just see what happens. Yeah. Okay, so instead of doing it like this, I can get rid of that reference up here and go back down here. I'm going to just test it the other way. So let's put them both on the screen. And so we're expecting this to be in the document. That's correct. Let's grab a reference to the name input and say that we expect it to have a value of Joe. Well, it says everything passed, so that's good news. I think I just got it to work. Although, what we didn't do is actually edit the contact. We need to edit the contact and make sure that it's coming back as expected. So, sure, it renders that properly. Now let's edit this. So, let's fire an event for .change on the name input. And the value, let's update the value. We're just coming over here to copy. Here we go. Let's change the name from Joe to port.exe. Okay. So now at this point, we would expect, whoops, local storage to get called with a new object, which is all of the same as Joe except for the name, where the name should now be port.exe. Let's see what happens here. So it looks like it did not update the name. I think it's because I need to actually submit the form, right? So I updated the input, but I need to submit the form. So let's do that. Let's see. Let's just click the submit button. That's probably the easiest way to do it. So over here on the left, I'm going to say fire event dot click. Whoops. We're going to click on the submit button. So clicking on the submit button should submit the form. See if that works. And okay. So in the edit case, we still have to add a little bit more functionality because we are setting edit contact to be undefined, but what we have yet to do is go into local storage and set the item. 1 second. Jeez Louise. So set contacts equal to new contacts. So let's actually create a reference called new contacts. Grab this logic. New contacts is that. And then we will set contacts to new contacts. And then we will json.stringify new contacts. All right. Feel like we're close. Okay. So it's now getting called again. So we got a little bit further because it's calling it again. But it's not updating the name to port.exe. So why might that be? Let's see. So let's run through this one more time. So on the submit, if the index is equal to edit contact, then we want to return C. So I'm going to log console.log C. And you know, yeah, let's log this. It should log it out somewhere. Here it is. So the name is Joe. It should be port.exe, right? So somewhere it looks like it's not working as expected. So let's check here in the test that it is actually updating the name. Like we're firing the event, but is it updating the name? Let's find out. So it's not. So expecting name input to have value port exe. It's receiving Joe. So this line right here where we're firing the event on the name input, it's not updating it to port exe. Okay. Okay, so why might that be? Do I need to... Oh, it's because there is no placeholder text at that given point anymore, is there? Ah. So grabbing it by the placeholder text isn't going to work. So instead, we're going to have to... we're going to have to grab it a different way. So let's do screen.getByText or getByValue. Is that a thing? GetByDisplayValue. What does that do? What is that going to grab? I don't know if this one's going to work, but let's try it. Nope. Oh, wait, why did it... Huh? 125. Oh, yeah, I mean, I have to update this reference. This is kind of weird. Yeah, it's not finding it. So if we look, it still says Joe. Oh, it's grabbing it from the contact list. Oh my gosh, man. This is not... Getting stuck on these small things is not what I wanted to do today. But I think this is the very last test, so that's good. Fire event.change. So instead of using getByDisplayValue, we can't do that. The surefire way is to set test IDs in the freaking form, if I haven't already. I really wanted to avoid doing that. Is there a way to get a get input by value? Can we do that? Oh, no, wait. Where's setup coming from? Setup, Get by label text. I don't have labels, so that's not going to work for me. Display value won't work. Get by role. Okay, but then you have to have a name. Unfortunately, the only way to really do this right now is going to be to add a test ID. So I'm caving in, I'm doing it. So for the name, we're going to have data hyphen test ID. Set this equal to name input. There you go. So now instead of grabbing it from the placeholder text, might as well just use get by test ID. Whoa. And I might as well do that, like I'll do a search replace. So wherever we're doing this, we're going to do screen.get by test ID name input. There we go. So now let's fire this change event on the name input. And then I should expect this to have value port exe now underneath there. Save. Let's see what happens. Come on. Still not working. So it expected it to have port exe received Joe. How weird is this? MRKZ is now following. Thank you. Appreciate that. I wonder if it's again a reference problem. If that's the case, I'm not going to be that happy. This is so weird. I'm actually kind of confused at this point. Like, I really don't know what's going on because I have a reference to the name input. Right? I have a reference to the name input. I am expecting the value to be Joe. I'm firing an event, a change event, for the name input. The value should now be port exe. Now I'm expecting the name input to have value port exe. But no, that's not the case. I'll just comment all this out because I'm not even getting that far. How strange is this? What could I be doing wrong? Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. I'm so dumb. I figured it out. All right. The problem is that it needs to be target. Like that. Yep, that did it. Okay, well, since that did it, it makes me want to just get rid of the test ID. So I'm going to get rid of the test ID that I just added. And instead of grabbing it by reference of test ID, again, we'll go back to how we were doing it before, which was get by placeholder text. So do that. See if it still works. Yep. So then we'll uncomment the rest of the test, see if this works. Okay. Now we're actually getting to the nitty-gritty. So it expected this. It got called with this. Oh, looks like I forgot an S. That must be happening in here. Yep, I forgot an S right here. That's kind of extremely important. Hooray. All the tests appear to be done. So I think I completely built this thing pretty much without looking at it on the screen, except for that, like the first stream, we did a very small screen test. So I have no idea what this even looks like on the screen. There's been no CSS, absolutely no CSS whatsoever. So I know it's going to look really, really, really ugly. But in theory, it should work. Like I'm kind of excited to try this out, but also scared. Let's start up the app and see what this thing looks like. Just got to wait 20 years for it to boot. There it is. Still loading. There we go. Okay, so we have an add contact button. If I click it, I get the form. So let's add Joe. Phone number. There we go. Just add in an email and submit. And now we see Joe, phone number, the email, the edit, and the delete button. If I click edit, it brings up the modal, and yeah, I mean, this is working. If I click cancel, it goes away. Let's add one more contact. Let's say Bob, phone number, email, submit. And now we have 2 on here. If we click edit on Bob, we get the form with Bob pre-filled. Now let's see if we can actually update. So let's edit Joe. Let's edit Joe's phone number to be all ones. Submit that. The edit case works good. Now let's delete Bob. Sorry, Bob. And it works. If I refresh, it saved Joe. So honestly, this appears to be working. It's fully working. There's a couple of small edge cases that we probably could have found more easily if we were doing manual click testing. For example, if I click add contact here, the add contact button should probably be disabled, but I think maybe not disabled, but there should probably be like a backdrop on the modal that disallows you from being able to click the add contact button if you're already adding a contact. I mean, clicking this does nothing though, because all it does is flip that Boolean. So it's not really a bug. So actually, as it turns out, this thing is good to go. Now it just needs some styling, right? I mean, this is kind of horribly ugly. So I think I could either start the styling now, or I could stop here and continue the stream a different day. But I think what I'm gonna do is at least break down some of the components into their own components, like the form. Maybe I should have like input components, and then just get that far and then worry about the styling in the final video. I think that's what I'm going to do. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's get out of the actual app here. I don't care about the app anymore, just care about the tests again. So we'll just go ahead and get the test runner going. They should all be passing because I didn't change anything. So, and if we go to the contact modal, you can see that within here, there's a lot of this, like, there's a lot of logic going on in here. And this can be broken down quite a bit into their own kind of components. Input components specifically that manages their own input state. So let's get that far. And while I'm doing this, I can actually, and someone said, now I understand the importance of testing. You're gonna actually understand it even better now because look, we have 17 tests that are passing right now. We were testing the app pretty thoroughly. It could be a little bit more thorough, but it's decent. And so now we're going to completely change the structure of how the app works, right? We're going to break this contact modal component into a bunch of other components. So there's going to be these individual input components. And by the time we're done, we can see if the tests are still passing. And if they're still passing, we can feel pretty confident that we didn't introduce bugs in our refactor. But if we didn't have all these tests and we did that, we'd have to always kind of wonder, did I introduce bugs when I did that refactor? Well, not with TDD, and that's what I love about writing tests as I do these things. It's really good for that. So here I'm going to open a new folder, and we're going to call this input. And I'm just going to knock this boilerplate out really quick, so just give me a moment. Okay. So I'm going to open up my contact modal on the right and have my input on the left. And let's look at what all of these inputs have in common. All of these inputs have a few things in common. One, they have an error message. They have a spot for an error message. They have the actual input, and then they have a container. So that's always the same for all of these. So since that's the case, I can kind of copy this skeleton over and say that we should return this basic skeleton here, but we need to change and make all of this dynamic. All right. So let's say this thing accepts some props here. Let's say it accepts a value prop. What is the value for this input? And we'll pass in value here. We should also accept a name prop. What is the name for this input? And that should be the place, not name, let's say label. Let's go with label. And then we'll set the placeholder equal to label. Okay, so we're gonna need an error message. And that will be this right here. And then finally, we only want to display this error message if it exists. Okay, and then the very final thing here is probably an on change. Let's say we pass in an on change prop as well. And we can actually make this easier by saying on change. And then we can call a prop called on change. And instead of passing in, let's not call it on change. Let's call it like on value updated. And instead of passing in the entire event, let's call on value updated with just the text. So e.value.text. That'll make the implementation easier on the actual modal side. So now let's start implementing this input component. See how much code we can reduce. All right. So going down here, starting at this level here, I'm going to comment this whole block out and replace it with an input. And pretty much just feed these in. And by the way, let's also add one more small thing called required, which is going to be a Boolean. And let's initialize it as true. So if it's ever false, like if we ever want to add something to the form where the input is not required, we can just override that and say false, but it'll always be true by default. And so for the input, we can say required is equal to required. All right. So let's pass in a few things. We're going to need the value. We are going to need the label. And got another question in the chat. I'll be answering all the questions in the chat at the end of the stream. So stick around. The label is going to be, for this input, it's going to be name. And we need an error message. The error message is going to be name error. So error message equals name error. And then finally, the on change is right here. Or we call it on value updated. Val. I'll be answering all your questions at the end of the stream, which actually the end of the stream is very soon. So don't miss it. So instead of doing set name e.target.value, we can just set it to val. All right. This right here, this tiny bit of code now replaces this huge chunk of code. It's pretty convenient. So now delete that. And I'm going to do the same for the other inputs. There was only 3 in total, so this will only take a second. So here we're going to do value is phone. The label is phone number. The error message is phone error. And the on click is going to be this. Replace this with val. And then that means we can now delete this whole block here. And then the final one, email. All right, so this will be email. This would be email address. This is going to be email error. And we'll do set email and set email dirty. Okay. So drastically reducing the amount of code that's going on here. Do the tests pass? That is the big question. Okay, so the tests are not passing here. So what that means is we've introduced a regression, and actually quite a few tests have failed. So let's see before I even look at that, I want to take a look and see what might be causing this to happen. Let's find out. And it could even be, let's see what this says. It says, cannot read property text of undefined. So Oh, why did I say e.value.text? What? e.target.value. How did that happen? I must have just been blanking it on that one. All right, everything passed. There was nothing wrong. False alarm. Okay, so by doing these changes, by having these tests, I was able to confidently make these changes without feeling like I'm introducing bugs. Now, the only other thing that we could add as a refactor is to kind of like take all of this validation logic and the dirty logic and all that stuff, move it out of this component and into here so that each input can manage its own like dirty state and validation state. But I'm not going to go that far. I just wanted to demonstrate that TDD helps in making refactors because it can give you the confidence to do that. And I don't want to spend too much time doing this other stuff. So I think it's time to answer some questions. Didn't get that many this time around, so this will be nice and short. Could you also give a bit of advice on how to start freelancing and how to get projects? Love your content, by the way. So to get freelancing, it's kind of broad. Like there's so many different ways you can get freelancing contracts or like the way that I started. First of all, it depends on like how much experience do you have? Do you have a portfolio? Because depending on where you're looking, a lot of places are going to just require that you have some sort of big body of work that they can look at. They want to know, do you have like testimonials? Are they going to spend their money and is it going to be a waste of their money, or are they going to spend their money and they're going to be happy with the product? They need some way to feel confident that they're spending their money on something that's going to be worth the money. So if you don't have anything like that at all, unfortunately, you kind of need to start off by just getting the contacts, getting the clients that you're just able to. So when I first started off, I actually literally went to local businesses and said, hey, look, I will do your website for free. And different organizations will be like, hey, I will build you an app and I'll do it completely for free if you'll just let me. And I did that for a while, and I eventually built up some contacts and a body of work that I was able to show people. So then when I went to apply to more official places where I was going to charge money, I say apply, but freelancing, it's not really applying, kind of is though. But I had a body of work. I could say, yes, I did this thing and I did this thing, and I could show them. And then those people that I did the free work for were really happy. So they were happy because not only was it a good job, but also it was free. So they were super willing to provide testimonials, and they were super willing to like have these new freelance clients potentially call them and ask them how the job was. Do you think it would be worth me spending money on, etc. So just go get the clients that you can, even if you have to work for free. It's hard starting off as a freelancer, but it ends up being worth it, I think, if you're into that sort of thing. Eventually, I went away from freelancing, though, because you get a lot more benefits if you work for a big company, and it can also pay a lot more. Can you please make a live event or video where you talk architecture-driven development, where you cover all architecture, MVVM, MVC, and any other with all examples? So when you say architecture-driven development, that confuses me quite a bit because every bit of development is architecture-driven, right? Hopefully. If not, then you're doing something wrong. But I think I understand what you mean. I think you're asking for me to do a video on different architectures and when to choose certain architectures over the other ones. I can absolutely do that. I love talking about architecture because I feel like the more you get into development and the more that you build tons and tons and tons of apps, you start to, first you start off not understanding architecture at all. You're just like, what is this? You just start using stacks and things that people have made, like predefined architectures that just have worked for long periods of time, and people just say, you should use this architecture. But then over time, you start to understand why those architectures are popular, and then the next level up from that is like you building your own architectures, and I would love to make a video on that. So another question is, which terminal is this? It looks really good. This is the Windows, what is it called? Windows Terminal, I think is what it's called. And you can choose between Windows PowerShell, Command Prompt, Ubuntu, Azure Cloud Shell. You can make custom modes. Like I have a tutorial mode, which If I enable, I think it's just got like big text and it's Windows PowerShell. Like I manually had to zoom in here when I first opened this, but if it was in tutorial mode, then it would have already been zoomed in. And you can do all kinds of awesome stuff with the Windows terminal. I think it's open source. Okay. Do I want to become famous? Buy followers, primes, and viewers on cut.ly, bigfollows.com. Do I want to become famous? Well, clearly this is a bot, but bots are humans too, right? No, maybe as a side effect of like helping a lot of people out. That would be cool. Okay, next question. Now I understand the importance of testing. That's not really a question, but I'm glad you understand the importance of testing because that is actually a very important piece of development in general. What language is best for backend? There is no best language for backend. It's what are you comfortable with? What is like widely accepted? Because for example, maybe 5 years ago, maybe not 5, about 4 or 5 years ago, Go was a great programming language. It still is, but not many people knew it. So even though it's a great programming language, the fact that not many people knew it made it not as good of a choice per se as something like Python or Node.js, just simply due to the fact that it had less adoption. So it's like you want to pick something that is super stable, super powerful, is fast, easy to use, and is widely adopted. And those are going to be things like Python, Node.js, Go, Ruby on Rails, unfortunately, Java, and then some C#, C, C++. But if you were to ask me, if you are a full stack developer and you're the type of developer that likes doing JavaScript instead of like a Ruby on Rails full stack type thing, if you prefer to do things like React, Angular, or vanilla JavaScript, Vue, Svelte, if that's what you like doing on the front end, highly recommend Node.js on the back end because it's the same language. So it's like, it just makes sense. Do you prefer using data test ID, attribute, or classes in your tests? Well, classes is how I'm going to be doing my styling in CSS. But since I use CSS modules, when I use CSS modules, it actually edits the class names and adds a unique identifier to the end of the class name. So I can't really target the elements via the class name in my tests because they are adding those unique IDs to the end. So sometimes I have to use data test IDs. I don't like using data test IDs though because they're so specific to the use case of testing that it just feels like you're littering your source code with like testy stuff. And I don't want to litter my code with test stuff. So yeah, I prefer to grab items any way I can other than test IDs. But if it ends up meaning that I have to go and jump through a bunch of hoops to do it, I'll just add a test ID. Can you explain how would you move the states for each input into the input component? Oh, I can do a really quick explanation, like a really quick explanation. Like I already moved some of the state into the component, right? But not really because it's props. But like, let's say we wanted to, just move the dirty state, like whether or not we're setting it as dirty. As you can see, we are setting dirty in this higher order component, and we have a different dirty state for every single input. We have set name dirty, we have set phone dirty. We could come in here and say const is dirty, and then set is dirty. Whoops. Set is dirty. What? Is equal to use state, and then this input component will have its own concept of dirty for itself. And we'll update that on the onChange here instead of in here. And then that way we don't have all this extra state. And you know what? I would do that right now, but again, I don't want to waste too much time. But that would be the start of it. And then you could do the exact same thing for the error messages. But you would have to accept a new prop called a validator. And then each of these inputs would probably require you to pass in some sort of regular expression or a series of AND statements that short circuit to a Boolean value that says the value is valid if this is the scenario, if this is the case. And then this component over here could accept that validator as a prop, and each time it runs on change, it can run it through that validator and then update its own state in here that's like is valid. Hopefully that makes sense. Next question. Would you use test-driven development in real projects? I feel like it's too much work when I just want to get stuff working at first and I can get back to writing tests later. All right, so Yazuf, that is a decent question. And it does depend on what you're building. But what I would say is that I felt this way too. I feel like it's too much work when I just want to get stuff working at first and I can get back to writing tests later. I felt that way too, but as I started to build bigger projects, I started to realize it's actually less work. The reason why is because when you're building a feature, it's fresh in your mind. You understand the requirements the best at that moment. There's never going to be a moment where you understand, where it's in your mind as well as it is at that moment in time. So that is the best time to write the test, the most effective test. And also, kind of like how I was showing you here, as you write these tests, if you need to make a change to a feature, or if you are building things later on that kind of depends on these smaller, like lower level features, you're preventing yourself from introducing regressions. Because if you do something, like if you decide to finally abstract some of the logic from a large component into their own components, you might break some of your old tests and immediately know that there's a bug. So you're actually saving yourself a lot of potential time and like a lot of anger and stress by doing it this way. And also, there's a lot of times where you might want to build a feature that relies on another feature that you can't work on yet, or that you just don't want to work on yet. And so the only way you'd be able to do that is to either mock or like kind of create a hacky sandbox environment, or to just simply write it and write tests and do it in a TDD way. Do you think that tests are useful for a simple front website that just displays data? Yes, because you want to make sure that you're displaying the data you expect. And those type of websites are actually the easiest to write tests for, because all you have to do is create fixtures or mock data, whatever you want to call it, to pass into those components, and then just write assertions that expects the data you're passing in to be on the screen in the way that you expect. So yes, I do think it's important. And on top of that, I think it's the easiest way to test things. Josh Miles, LOL, bots are people too. Yeah. Well, if we want to get super philosophical, maybe we are the bots. Okay, Yazuf says, in that case, I would prefer ID over data test ID. Well, the thing about ID is, again, I kind of agree, but you don't want to add like a million IDs. So in some of the things that we were rendering, for example, the contact list, if we added a data test ID for all of those, that kind of makes sense, right? We would have a data test ID for like contact 1, contact 2, contact 3, contact 4, because let's say there's 100 contacts in your contact list, we would have a data test ID for like 100 contacts. But IDs are really used for like grabbing items in your actual logic, your code logic, or, in JavaScript, or selecting it in CSS. And so if you had 100 of those, it just doesn't seem like the best way to do it. I mean, I guess you could, but data test ID in a scenario like that seems like it's a better, more specific use case for having, for selecting. Unless you're also going to add styles to it. But remember, you really want to only add IDs when there's only going to be one specific item. Maybe like the modal. For example, in the app that I built, the contact modal could have potentially had an ID called like contact modal, because there's only ever going to be one. Okay. Is valid being the underscore valid expression in the main component, right? Thank you, Mr. Boston24, for the follow. Appreciate that. Now let me show you what he's talking about, or she. Let me show you what they're talking about. So is valid being the underscore expression. Here, let's look at this. I know exactly what they're talking about. That was in here. And here it is. Okay. So quick explanation of what's going on. So if you don't know what IIFEs are, IIFE, Google that after this stream. If you don't know what that is, Google it. But it stands for immediately invoked function expression. If you don't know what a function expression is, you should also Google that. Those are two concepts that you need to know in order to understand what's going on here. But basically, we're passing in a function expression. This function expression here just does a couple of checks and then it returns a Boolean value. That's all it's going to do. It's just this function right here, this arrow function, is just returning a Boolean value. So whenever we call this function, it's going to return either true or false. But then we're immediately invoking that. If you look at these parentheses right here, you can see basically what we're doing is we're defining a function and then we're immediately executing that function. So since we're executing the function, what this ends up being is the value that the function returns, not the function itself. So this value here, underscore valid, ends up either just being true or being false. It has no reference to the function at all, only the value it returns. Okay, what else we got? I know ID is supposed to be unique. Yes. Surrender PD says, I am, let's see, it's kind of hard to, let's move it over here so we can see it. Surrender PD. I don't know how to, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Surrender. I am building a project right now using a Firebase as the database, as it is a small project, but in case I am expanding the project where there will be a lot of read and writes, do you think Firebase would be reliable? Yes. Firebase is great. Highly recommend it. I mean, it's designed in such a way that it is so efficient, right? I'm just going to be honest. That requires its own video to talk about how Firebase works. But yeah, it's going to suit your use case. I would believe so, in my opinion. And then it said, or what do you think I should use? I think you should, if you're not a backend engineer and you really don't want to worry about having like a huge custom server that you build, Firebase is just a great option. Just make sure that you understand how to properly structure your data in Firebase and also manage the rules for the Fire store and all that good stuff. Just like really understand what you're doing with Firebase. But yeah, it's an amazing tool. I love Firebase. I don't know what skedum means. I understood that, but I skedum. Well, I'm not up to date on these kids' lingo. No, I don't know what you're saying. Sorry. But I'm glad you understood it. All right. Oh, wait. Updated response here. I asked whether the underscore valid expression is going to be the isValid function when we code the input validation function. Let me read that again. I asked whether the underscore valid expression. Okay, let me take this bit by bit here. So, okay, so you're talking about the value is valid because underscore valid is not an expression. It is just a Boolean value. It's not an expression. But if it's going to be the isValid function, so no, it's definitely not because it's only true or false. So it's not a function. When we code the input validation function. No. But you know what? Due to what I think there's some confusion going on here with how you're understanding how this works, I think at some point I might kind of do like a recreation of Formic, which kind of does this brilliantly. Just so everyone can understand how this works, I might do that in the future. All right. I think that's all the questions. I think I can pretty much go ahead and call it a day on this. I'm going to come back and finish this stream in terms of the styling. That's going to be the final thing because as I promised you all, this time I'm actually going to do the styling. I'm going to make it look good. I'm going to use CSS grid and probably some color palette. But yeah, looking forward to that. Thanks everyone for showing up. Have a great day, everyone.